evening, everybody, and I'm delighted to be here this evening, and I'm going to talk to you about William Smith in South Wales. Actually, this is based on a presentation I gave during the centenary year at the Geological Society, and I haven't done very much with it since, but I did accumulate some other information, which I've sort of put together in this. But it is some of it is work in progress in terms of there are things to look at in more detail, and I think with your local knowledge you may be able to even add into that. So here we go. Let's have a look at it. Well, I've focused in on the Smith's 1815 map, as you know, and looked in at the bit there that we're going to concentrate on, which really goes across from Pembrokeshire across to the Forest of Dean. Now, I've included the Forest of Dean for good reason. We will actually also zoom out a little bit to have a look at other parts of the map as well, because they are significant in terms of trying to understand what happened in terms of the map, in terms of Smith. But there are two different aspects we're going to look at here. Let's see if I can get this. Does this work? There we go. That's working now. And I'm going to start with looking at a little bit of background about Smith himself. This is an interesting self-portrait drawn by Smith himself, which some of you may not have seen. So rather than put the standard portrait, which is by Forrow, of Smith, I thought it might be more interesting to put his self-portrait up there. But I'm just going to give you a little bit of background, and some of this is quite important in terms of trying to understand what actually happened, or his work in South Wales in particular. So he was born in Churchill, Oxfordshire, from quite humble origins. He was orphaned at the age of 7. In fact, his father died. His mother then remarried elsewhere, but he was taken on, in fact, by his uncle. He had a village education up to about 1780 in arithmetic, writing, and scripture. Now that's going to be quite important in terms of certainly that latter part, scripture, in terms of what we're going to have a look at later. So you really need to cast your mind back, or try and cast your head back to the very late 18th century, or the late 18th century, when and education at that time, and this idea of scripture and what was being taught at that time, as well as arithmetic and writing. 1787, he was assistant to Edward Webb as a land surveyor. In the interim, he'd actually been working for his uncle on a farm, and he was a bright lad, and he'd been noticed by Edward Webb, who was in Stow-on-the-Wold, and he employed him as an assistant land surveyor. And he taught him and mentored him, and sent him off in 1791 to North Somerset to survey a series of estates. And on that, it was on the North Somerset coalfield, and he became involved in 1792, 1793 in what he would term as subterraneous surveys at that time. In other words, he was looking at the coal fields, the coal mines, and looking at the sequences that were in there. He was interested. He'd always been interested in geology, but in particular, he was picking up some of the ideas about strata at that time. At that time also, he encountered the ideas of John Strachey. So, 1791, sorry. 1719 to 1801, John Strachey. But he'd encountered them, Smith encountered them, because Strachey was from North Somersetshire, and he was living there at that time, and he published earlier on some ideas. Now, I'm going to talk about those again in a little while. We'll pick up on the ideas of John Strachey. 1794, Smith set off on a tour of England, returning via Shropshire and Wales, and this is when Wales first enters, and we'll pick up on aspects of that in a minute. He was working on the Somersetshire Coal Canal from 1793 to 1799, and then in 1799 he was fired because he had a disagreement about the building of lock gates and how they should be done, And so he set himself up in Bath at that stage as a land drainer from 1799 to 1803, and continued as a land drainer. He earned most of his living actually through land draining and then other work that he acquired. But he moved to London then in 1803. So from 1803 to 1819, he was based in London. So that's a very quick potted history. But some of that background, as I say, will be quite important in terms of trying to understand his work in South Wales. One of the things that I'm going to pick up on is in 1801, Smith, he started developing ideas quite early about the strata, and from his tours, he picked up some idea about the delineation of the strata, and he thought he should produce a map because he thought it would be useful. And in that, as a result, he actually produced a prospectus, and here's a copy of the first page of the prospectus. And in fact, I'm going to quote a little bit later from the preface, which was not published within the prospectus, but he did write a preface to it, which begins to outline some of his idea and thinking about strata, his geological thinking, if you like. But on this, you can see that he's marked on, there's nothing really marked on within South Wales except for coal mines, and he's obviously got the coal areas marked on there, but there's nothing except he's got this red area marked down in 1801. Now, obviously, that was developed a little bit later, but we'll see how that develops later. Let's see if I can move that screen a little bit. I'm just going to move on a little bit. In his preface that he wrote, that was never published, it was quite long, but there is a copy of it. He wrote this about those strata. He will there find independent and partial local dips which appear in different quarries and of the same stone, that the top and bottom layers of each complete stratum or class of stones or earth, considered as a mass, has a general tendency towards the east horizon, and that this regularity and uniform disposition is found the same on one side of a deep valley or channel as on the other over an extent of many miles, when proper allowances are made for its inclination and for the variation of the surface. He then goes on, the continuation of the strata in such a direction must consequently form a set of lines extending from pole to pole with a regular inclination to the east. And the motion of the earth, which probably commenced while the strata were still in a soft state or of a pulpy consistence, would naturally place them in an inclined curvilineal position. And the same centrifugal force which, upon Newton's principles, produced the spheroidal form of the earth, would also distend the strata near the line much more than at the poles, and produce the effect herein described. But I do not mean to establish this as a complete theory of the earth, or attempt anything of the kind in the present performance, but merely to suggest such ideas as have unavoidably occurred in the tracing of strata herein delineated. Well, there we have some idea of Smith's early ideas, or ideas that formed the way he was beginning to think about strata. Often, I don't think perhaps articulated very much, but he did have some ideas about how his strata were formed. Well, he set off on his tour on a tour of Wales in September and October 1802, having done a tour of England and North Wales, but he'd done a tour of September, October, across to Wales. And I'll outline where he went shortly, but he wrote subsequently to Thomas Jones of Havod, which is a large estate just south of Plynlimmon, near Aberystwyth. And he wrote to Jones and said, I am much obliged for your subscription, by your favor of your subscription. So at this stage, he'd written to Jones because Jones had subscribed to his prospectus that he put out for his initial map, or that he was going to do. Jones actually subsequently was a subscriber to the map itself and received a map of itself. But in this, he also said, I am just returned to this place from a tour of North and South Wales. This is how we know he went to South Wales. I went to Carmarthen through Llandilo, Llandovery, Builth, Ryder, Dolgellau, Carnarvonshire and Chester. So we've got some idea of his first route, a first encounter of where he went. Through Carmarthen and then up the road. In fact, I mean, interestingly enough, this is also the route, much the route that Murchison took, at least as far as Builth and Ryder, about 30 years later. So that's his first encounter with Wales, really. What's interesting is I think on that tour, or in fact on another tour of England and Wales in 1794, which was part of his work to look at canals, and they went all the way up to Newcastle and then came back via Shropshire and Wales to get back to Bath. And on that trip, well, there's no direct evidence, but it's possible that he may have met Richard Crashaw. Smith was certainly well acquainted with Crashaw, and Merthyr Tydfil, most people know about Crashaw, the ironmaster, and he was well acquainted with him, and I'll show you how and in what way shortly. I suspect that he possibly met him on his return from his 1794 tour, rather than anything which was on the 1802 tour, because the 1802 tour didn't really go to Merthyr Tydfil. Here's a letter from Crochet to Smith at Carmarthen, and it says really Smith was trying to talk to people he knew, to people who were influential, he thought were influential, who were friendly to him, who believed in his project, and tried to get them to solicit support from various people. So he'd written to Crochet. We haven't got the letter from Smith, but we do have the reply. And it says, I have not the least acquaintance with Lord Cawdor. And he goes on to say he would gladly introduce him if he did, but he doesn't know him, or he doesn't have sufficient influence in that quarter. But he does say later, this is an 1805 letter, and again it says, dear sir, and it's an extract from it, but it gives you an indication of the relationship that Smith had with Crochet. It says, Dr. T's abilities may be inferior. This is when Smith was trying to still soliciting subscriptions for his map project. Dr. T's abilities may be inferior to Mr. Townsend's, but had you followed my recommendation, I really believe we would have a work of great celebrity published, from which you would have had the satisfaction of giving to the nation a new idea of raising an additional source of revenue from the bowels of the earth. I could dwell on the subject for an hour or more if my observations are likely to be attended with any advantage to you. Send me your new prospectus. If any reference to me will serve you, you are welcome to do so, but I'm too obscure a person to have influence. Crochet didn't think that he could really sort of influence the aristocracy. He was probably considered as an industrialist, although he got money. He didn't have much sway with with the aristocracy. But he signs off, I sincerely wish you well and am your friend, RC. So we've got some, giving you a flavor of Smith's involvement, at least through some of his tours of people in South Wales. And again, he was trying to talk with influential people so that for two reasons, really. One is to solicit for work, and secondly, to solicit for subscriptions to his map project. Well, let's focus in a little bit more, because before we get to his map, we need to really look at some aspects of where he was and where he worked, because you may not be aware, but Smith worked in South Wales, and that's quite important, I think, in terms of when we then come to consider his map. So we've already looked at the 1802 tour. In 1810, Smith worked for a considerable period of time at Kidwelly and on Colon Harbour, and in Larne on a sea bank, looking at plan and improvements there. And he also made visits to Tenby and Swansea. And in September of 1811, he went back and did works on the Kidwelly Harbour. And we'll look at that in a minute, a little while. So this is his map, and it's quite interesting, because the places where he went and people he talked with are actually marked on the map. So we've got Larne, and there were the marshes there, actually Pembrey marshes there, which he worked on, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. Kidwelly and the estuary there, in particular Trimsaran. He was involved in the owner of the Trimsaran estate, and I'll mention him in a minute, a man called Brogden. Middleton Park, which is where that features on the map. Golden Grove, again another estate, and Newton Park. So quite interesting that he got these marked on the Carey map, and I suspect that these particular estates marked on there, because there aren't any others marked on, were the influence of Smith under Carey. And he said, well, I know these people, and we should have them marked on. This is from the Smith Archive at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. And this is a plan of Mr. Watkins Saltmarsh at Larne, 1809. And Smith was working on trying to, by this time, he'd established himself as I say, a land drainage expert. And he was being employed, in fact, to make a plan and to build the wall to try and keep out the sea, and so that the land could be drained more easily. And he worked quite a bit on this salt marsh. We have a series of letters, but they haven't been properly transcribed. I've transcribed some of them, but they haven't been wholly transcribed, or I haven't wholly transcribed them. What we do have to get a full grip on what Smith was doing, and there are some gaps. But it does give us an idea of how he was working in South Wales. His major work, however, was on Kidwelly Harbour. And some of you may be well familiar with this. This is a slightly later version of it, but it's the same location that he was working at. What's interesting is that bottom right-hand photo there, and you can see from the top as well, we've still got sediment there. And that was the major issue that was dealing with the harbour. The harbour was built to ship out coal, but it kept silting up, and they needed a better construction of the harbour in order to try and deal with it. The man he was dealing with was called James Brogden, and Brogden employed him as you've seen a lot over 1809, 1810, and also 1811. And who was Brogden? Well, Brogden actually was an MP But he came from, he was a Russia merchant. This is actually from the History of Parliament online. It's difficult to find a great deal about Brogden, but he seems to have been, as I say, this made a fortune out of trading with Russia, and then used some of that fortune to be a speculator. And of course, at the dawn of the industrial period and the colonial period, there was a lot of money to be made if you managed to place it in the right companies or in the right ventures. And that's what Brogden did. And so in 1802, he amassed enough money to buy the Trimsaran estate, which is 530 acres. And of course, his interest there was the fact that it contained, or one of his interests was that it contained these coal and iron deposits. And that's what he was looking to exploit. He had a number of sort of, it's quite interesting if you look at him up on the Parliamentary Online website, because he had quite a colourful career in Parliament. So he was clearly a sort of an active wheel dealer in both politically as well as financially. And in fact, he did come undone in the 1830s, where he'd invested in a mine in Ireland, but and got quite a few investments, but actually a lot of it was fraudulent. And so he was involved in a massive scandal, which was his downfall. But at this time, he was on the make, and he was on the make from the coal that could be found in West Wales. And we can see the sort of involvement. This is letters that you can see from Smith, from Brogden to Smith, and a whole host of financial material going through. And this is part of the interest, one of the letters that you can see. And in fact, you can see the diagram in the middle. This is Brogden. You can see his signature at the bottom, writing to Smith to say, this is some of the difficulty that we've got. And you can see the Larne River going up to the north. And in fact, this is the Kidwelly River with a branch which is coming down slightly southeast on this map. You can see he's dotted across the top of it, because what's happening is it's beginning to silt up. And his idea is that what they should do is perhaps drive a canal further down the estuary. And that's really one of the things that he was trying to sort of get out of Smith. They made substantial changes to the canal or to the harbour over his time, but then it was built over later on, so that it's uncertain exactly what Smith did. And as I say, it may be that some of the detailed delving into the archive and some more transcription of the letters may reveal exactly what happened to Smith. We don't know, or what exactly happened to the harbour. We know it was a continual problem, and it was then rebuilt again in 1819, which wasn't Smith's doing. This episode of his work is not really covered very much in his Philip's memoirs of him, and it's not known, as far as I know, in any history of this part of Carmarthenshire. So it's and certainly if you look at any histories of the histories I've looked at in terms of the Kidwelly Harbour, Smith isn't mentioned. So I think, as I say, this is an area which could really probably be uncovered a little bit more. In that, whilst he was there, I mean, he was introduced, and Brogden probably introduced him to the local aristocracy and notaries, and in particular Sir William Paxton. And here's, for example, and you will know, of course, of Paxton's Tower, probably. And this is Paxton inviting Smith to come and visit him. Invitation to Middleton Hall, where he says, I wish to consult with you on some points connected with improvement of the trade of Kidwelly. And he's really wanting to talk to Smith about going to, there's Paxton, by the way, and there's a picture of Middleton Hall, which is now on the site of the Botanic Garden, National Botanic Gardens, which, but he was interested really in he got coal interest there, and he really wanted to sort of make more of his money. And he wanted to consult Smith about the improvements in coal and improvements in drainage and the improvements that he might make in terms of transport. I've got an idea here, I've got some idea here at least of what his timetable was. So this is during 1811, and this is his diary, or aspects of his diary. And it just gives you an indication of where he was at. So 2nd of May, meeting Something House, Tellenry, Kidwelly Harbour. And in 9th of July, he was at Bath. And then September, he went to Bristol and wrote letters about, not quite sure, and a boat or something across, coached to Wales, arrived at Llanon. 26th, he stayed at the Ivy Bush, and he wrote on the strata of the Red Rab. So at this time, although he was visiting for his civil engineering work, he was also obviously looking at some of the rocks. So there's a variety of things that you can see in October. He's talking about on coals of the North Dip. Lewis called, walked to Trinsaran, wrote at Kidwelly, wrote on the proposed lock, and then paying workmen at various other tasks he was doing. So some of the detail of this is in his diary. And he also went to, at this time, I'm not sure whether he went to Llantrisant, but he certainly was consulted about something on Llantrisant, because there's this note in his diary here, which says on the October 26th that Sir John Aubrey called, and he said was being consulted on working a 3-foot vein of coal on his estate called Glyn by the railway near Llantrisant. So he was certainly being consulted on a variety of things. And Smith was keen to really inculcate his and incubate lots of relationships with the gentry and people who got money, because it meant he could get some work. Well, right, let's see where we're at now. Why that's gone there. Having looked through there, let's have a look. So what we're going to do now is perhaps have a look at his map, and particularly look at his map of South Wales. And what's interesting here is when you zoom in, if you look carefully, you can see there's lots of blues on there. The black is pretty obvious, but we've got lots of blues. Let's see if we can get, I don't know, it should go back. I think it should have. I don't know where that's gone. Never mind, don't worry. Okay. What I'm going to point out here, though, is that if we look at the blue colors, we've actually got two distinct blues here that we can look at. And there they are. You can see that there's the dark blue, and you can see that on, I've blown up the explanation of colors at the bottom. And the dark blue is what he calls the Derbyshire limestone, and what we would call carboniferous limestone, and that runs on the rim, and he's marked that on. And then you can see they've got a very different color, a slightly different color blue. It does vary on different maps, and sometimes it's quite difficult to pick up. But here we've got the Magnesian limestone, what he calls the Magnesian limestone, which runs across Forest of Dean, Glamorganshire, the Gower, and then through into Pembrokeshire. Smith, when he was uncertain about certain things, would leave areas blank, and which is why I think that occurs in Pembrokeshire. And there are some blank areas in Pembrokeshire where he thinks he's not quite sure what's there, so he's left it blank. But that's quite interesting that he marks it on as Magnesian limestone, and we're going to try and examine aspects of that. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, Magnesian limestone, what's that about in terms of Glamorgan and the Gower? Well, let's see what we can pick up. We're not the first to sort of realize this. It's been picked up at various stages, and here is our good friend North, who in 1832 wrote in his little booklet From the Geological Map to Geological Survey, under Magnesian limestone, it's difficult to understand how Smith made this error. Well, what I hope to do is to perhaps try and explore and understand how Smith made an error, if an error it was. And I think it's always easy for us to judge people now with our knowledge, and we sometimes have to try and divest ourselves of that and try and get back into the minds of the individuals of that time. It's quite a difficult job to do, but we have to try and do that if we're really going to try and understand it. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Let's see what we've got here. First of all, let's have a look at his route. Where did Smith go? Because that would obviously help us in terms of some of the observations that he might be able to make. And he, well, came from Bath, but to Bristol, and he would take the mail coach to Bristol. He was coming actually from London at this stage, but he often took it to Bristol, and then it would go across on the route there. There was also a route which went to Gloucester, and then from Gloucester it ended up at Brecon and went down the road through Llandilo and then to Carmarthen. So, but it seems most of the time from his diary that he went to Bath because he'd obviously got interest in Bath, and then from Bristol across the new passage that we're looking at there, and then along the, you know, what is the old A4 that we know about there. So, you know, the main route that is before the motorway, that most people would recognize. And similarly, of course, at the other end, where he went, except of course for the M4 bridge, he would have to go up to Neath, or he would take the Britain ferry and then take it across and off up the road. So we know his routes. He would cross the coalfield, and we also know that he would cross the area which he'd marked on as Magnesian limestone. How did he observe things? Well, we know some of his methods of recording strata from Philip's memoir. And Philip says he looked at boreholes, any boreholes or natural artificial sections he recorded there. In particular, what was quite interesting is that this is, quote, profile sections were sketched on most roads on which Mr. Smith passed over. And he gives an example, in fact, in Oxfordshire, but it gives you an idea that he was obviously trying to look at the land and look at the topography of the land and trying to work out from that. So it's really, it's relief mapping rather than stratigraphical mapping or fossil mapping. And natural cliffs were always copied. So he drew sections of cliffs where he could. So we got some idea of where he went. So it wasn't totally, you know, let's go and collect the fossils from here. He was mapping really as he went along or as he was traveling. And he was well known for wanting to travel up on the at the front of the coach where he could observe. And sometimes, of course, the coach moved remarkably slow where he could dismount and go and look at something before he got back on the coach. And that's how he observed a lot of his geology, the strata. So let's move on in terms of having a look at what we've got. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Quite interesting though, because when he's crossing South Glamorgan, the features are not particularly strong. So his feature mapping was not particularly useful to him, unlike, for example, where he would be going up the east of England, where he would see the bassets of these, the east sloping strata with their bassets facing west. And he could pick up from there what sort of rocks that we got. And famously, of course, he looked out from York Minster to see the chalk and decided it was the chalk away to his east, because he could see the escarpment. That's less easy in terms of looking at South Glamorgan. And again, a couple of images really looking across the sort of terrain that he would have to be able to look at. And again, many people everybody undoubtedly would be familiar with this sort of terrain there in South Glamorgan. So it's not the easiest to look at for feature mapping. He did have the South Glamorgan coast, but it's interesting as to whether he actually went to the South Glamorgan coast, or whether he was familiar with it. We'll look in a minute, and the answer is probably not. Or if he did, somehow he seemed to ignore it, but we'll have a look at that in a minute. The limestones, and this is Carboniferous limestone just south of, it's actually just south of Llantrisant, is quite red and red stained, as we know. And I think that influenced Smith in terms of some of his thinking and what sense he was making of this. There, lots of iron staining on the rock. There were quite a number of different sorts of rocks to be able to see. You can see the main road here, the old main road, going through the center of this, and we've got the Austria bands of Sutton stone. Some people will know this. This is really the central part of the old road going through mid Glamorgan, and Carboniferous, but we've also got these Sutton stones with the Austria beds, so quite prominent and quite clear as to the sort of materials there. So and not far from the road, you'll see there's a number of quarries marked on here, and undoubtedly they were probably quarrying along the way. But somehow that didn't seem to make an impression with Smith, or at least it doesn't register. There's nothing that he registers from this area. Now, whether he was rushing through and so didn't really take his time to look at it, not quite clear. We'll perhaps speculate on that in a little while. Again, quarries with fissures in them, Triassic fissures in mountain limestone, Pant quarry here. So this very ready material. And we'll have a look at some aspects of this a little bit later. Red iron staining within the limestone. And of course, as you're very familiar, we've got the conglomerate, the Trias conglomerate, which lies above. So we've got this breccia material, which again features in the sequence of Smith trying to understand the area, or not understanding the area. He'd seen some similar things in around Bristol, and we know about those. So he did have some understanding about that, but again, around Bristol, there was some confusion as to what the sequence in terms of the strata really was. And last but not least, I think in this sequence of photos, I've got the unconformity between the mountain limestone, what he would have called the mountain or Derbyshire limestone, and the puddingstone conglomerate, which lies on top of it. But again, it's not clear whether Smith actually ever saw this or explored it. It seems that he obviously traveled on the coach on the main road, and that was his main source of information. We'll have a look. In terms of that, here's the sequence that he wrote, and we've got the magnesian limestone, but you'll see he's written brecciated limestone, red marl, millstone, and brecciated limestone. So the material above is red, then the magnesian limestone, then the coal measures, and then the Derbyshire limestone, and then the red and dunstone, which we would call the old red sandstone. But it's this slight confusion that occurred between the magnesian limestone and the red brecciated limestone. So if he did see some of that, it's how did he make the sense of the sequence that he saw there? Well, let's have a look at his map in a little bit more detail. And this part, as you can see, is around Cowbridge, Bridgend, just off to the left of this map. It's actually the junction between one sheet and the next, further over. But it's quite interesting to have a look at, because what you can see is where it says Hensel at the start, at the top part there. You can see that darker blue, which is our the Derbyshire limestone or the mountain limestone, and here he's marked on the boundary, and you can see is a little bit uncertain as to where it went. So it's been changed slightly in various ways, engraved slightly different before he's finally settled on where it is. And then we've got this magnesian limestone, which is all going across South Glamorgan. What's interesting is, of course, he's marking an unconformity on there. And why did he do that? Did he have any evidence for that? What's the, what was his thinking at that time? Similarly, of course, he's got this indent and then this large lobe of magnesian limestone, which seems to sort of throw off north slightly. It's obviously indented into the stream, but then pushes north there. And how did he mark that? What was that was looking at to mark that? Well, let's have a look at this unconformity, because it's quite interesting. And here's Llanharry, mountain limestone magnesium unconformable boundary. And here's the geology that's there at the moment. And if we then go and look at it on the ground, and I did wonder and went over the ground to see if, well, what would Smith have seen if he had actually been there, if he'd been to Llantrisant, say, and walked south to have a look at it, what would he have seen? There's not a great deal, but there is a rise in the ground, which you can see there. So it might have been that if he had seen it, that was what he thought he was seeing. He was on mountain limestone, and then that was running into this sort of raised ground, or running under this raised ground in terms of his mountain limestone, the unconformity. And there it is again. In fact, of course, this material is not solid rock at all. It's superficial material, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. But it may have been, this is the ground looking from above, looking backwards, looking up towards Llantrisant, so towards the coal measures, with the mountain limestone or Derbyshire limestone in between, what we would call Carboniferous limestone. And this is on, if you go to the BGS viewer, you've got some views there. You can see it on there. So you could go and have a look at this. And you can overlay on top of that the superficial material. And there it is. That's the superficial geology on top. And if you look through that, let's go back a little bit. So from there to there, next one to there, you can see there's a sort of a vague, that sort of finger, if you like, on the southwest finger of superficial material, which that's that mound, that raised ground I was showing. It might have been that he was using that feature to try and mark on his unconformity, but it's difficult to say. Okay, one of the interesting things about this particular unconformity, though, is you can see he has marked it on. It's been very deliberate. If you look, let's go. If you look down where it says Wenvo, and Staling Down, and the corner of Staling Down, there is a line drawn. And if you follow that line up, it's drawn at an angle. It actually, it lines up with where the magnesian limestone is drawn around and where the unconformity is. So it's deliberately marked on, and that's not just on the one version of the map. I've checked that on several different maps, and you can see it again on the same thing. That's again a different map there, and a third map. The next feature I'm going to have a quick look at is this, as I say, this lobe sticking out, or what is marked as a sort of a lobe of magnesian limestone, which is north of Bridgend. And that's really, it's the Coa de Pebeth looking, and it is a prominent area. So it's possible that he was feature mapping to find that, you know, in the way that he drew these sections, and we knew that's one of the ways he was operating. There are caves in there, but I'm not sure that he ever went in and looked at that, because of those caves. They're reminiscent, of course, of the sort of caves you would find in Derbyshire, and I'm sure that he would have possibly related it to that, possibly related to Derbyshire limestone, but I don't know. Another possibility is that he was looking at soils and the way in which soils were draining. So I had a look at the soil map of the Vale of Glamorgan, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of great relationship that there is there. So it's a bit of a puzzle as to what was going on in Smith's mind, at least initially. Let's have a look at what other knowledge might have been around at the time. And if we look at, there was other knowledge of this area, and Smith was, well, it's difficult to conceive whether that Smith was not aware of some of this at the time. John Smeaton, and he was looking for lias limestones, which for his concrete, his cement, to manufacture cement. And as you can see here, it says, having heard of a lime produced from a stone found at Aberthor upon the coast of Glamorganshire that had the same qualities of setting in water, I was very anxious to procure some of the stones, which I did, and burnt it to lime. And he then mapped actually the lias, because he knew it occurred in the lias, and he mapped it north, as you can see at the bottom there, throughout Britain. So he was the first one really throughout England. He was the first to map the lias in order to find his material. But he writes in his narrative on building of the Eddystone Lighthouse, lias is a general term of strata of stone of the species Aberthor in several counties. So it was known, certainly as far as Smeaton was concerned. Oops, going the other way. Edward Martin had produced a description of the coal basin in 1806. So that was quite well known, and as part of the edges of that, he'd also highlighted what was there. We'll come back to that again in a minute. Interestingly enough, as well, this book published in 1815, which is by Walter Davies, and it was published as part of the Board of Agriculture's books. Ferry had produced one on Derbyshire, but this one was on South Wales. Walter Davies had already produced one on North Wales, and he got the contract to produce the one for South Wales. Interestingly enough, he marked, there's a soil map, what he calls a soil map here, but he marks the coal, but you can see that outside that he's marked on, south of the coal for varieties of limestone. So there were varieties of limestone that he knew about south of the coal. That's Walter Davies. Quite an interesting book, and just a slight aside to this, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, is that's the chap who actually provided much of the material for this book. Davies was actually from North Wales, And this is Iolo Morganwg, who was Edward Williams, who was a stonemason from Cowbridge, Flemston near Cowbridge. And he knew the area intimately. And in fact, he wanted to, or he tendered for the contract, didn't get it, but he did provide a lot of the information that's in that book. So he knew the area intimately because he was from the area and he worked on it. And in this, they decided, Davies at least highlights 4 different limestones. And white limestone is not from the same color of stone. There's a great number of varieties, good samples of marbles, brown, red, white, blue color, green, etc., but from the superior whiteness of the lime and its effervescent state after calcination. So the white limestone is the material that's we would probably call the mountain limestone or the Carboniferous limestone. But north of the white limestone is imperfectly stratified pudding stone on the verge of the coal tract. And so this pudding stone was quite important in terms of perhaps helping or the idea that was some of the idea thinking about Smith about where does this sit, where does it in the area, right? In that book, we have some nice sketches of the south coast, and the geology there is quite detailed. Now, Smith was big friends with Fairy. Fairy was his champion. Fairy had already written a book for the Board of Agriculture. It seems almost inconceivable that Smith did not know about this book and these diagrams and this description of the geology of South Glamorgan. So why did he apparently seem to ignore this? There are other evidences of work that was going on, which he may or may not known about, but he might well have known about. And Buckland and Conybeare were active in the area. Conybeare on 1811 did a tour and visited the South Wales coast. And well, we don't know this is actually part of that, but it's certainly possible because his later work is much more detailed, and this is sort of fairly rudimentary at the start of his work. But he clearly marks on Cold Nap Point at Barry and marks some of the fossils there. So that information was available. We've got a geological map of Glamorgan, which is by Buckland in a private collection. And this was done well before Smith's map. In fact, in 1815, Buckland said the information on the geology of Glamorganshire, which he hoped to receive from Lady Mary Cole and the Mrs. Talbots, will be wanted for the insertion in the Geological Society's map of England. That's the 1820 map, now far advanced in the hands of the engraver as it was in 1815. He asks for the return of part of the map of Glamorganshire, which includes 100 of Gower, and hopes to secure the remaining parts of Glamorganshire enriched by geological observations of the approaching summer, which he trusts the ladies will have their kindness to record upon. So this is the Penrice sisters who were providing information about Glamorganshire. Quite a detailed map, very different to the map that Smith made. So there's Smith's map at the top, and there's eventually the Greenough map at the bottom, which you can see looks much like the material that Buckland provided. In fact, Buckland did provide for that. So we've got detailed information going on, but Smith didn't seem to sort of follow that or make use of it at all. And, you know, again, this is Buckland's synoptic table in Phillips' 1818 book, Selection of Facts. And by this time, he'd written magnesium limestone, and then he'd written Lias. And you can see under Lias, it says Cowbridge, Dunraven, Glamorganshire, right? And then it says magnesium limestone. He got Cowbridge down there as well. So it was known about. The distribution of these rocks was known about, but Smith didn't seem to sort of make use of it. another couple of quick examples. And Smith was a little confused. If we go over to the Bristol area and the North Mendips area, he was equally confused. And you can see that the darker grey on the right is actually what he's got as the lias. And then the blue is the magnesian limestone with the red, the red marls on top of that, or breccias on top of that. And he'd not quite worked it out. You can see there one fades into the other, but the relationships between the two are not properly thought through or understood or depicted. And in fact, in 1813, Conybeare had recognized this, and he said, I'm engaged at present in colouring with Buckland's assistance the contiguous squares of the Gloucester, Somerset, East Devon on the outline map. In proceeding with this work, I find that I was myself mistaken, attributing error to Martin's account of the limestone of the south of the Nailsea coalfield, which are really mountain lime, not lias, as I had been induced to suppose from their appearing to form a continuation of the ridge on which Dundry Beacon stands. Now, that suggests that if we go back, that what Smith was doing, in part at least, was certainly not mapping by fossils, but he was mapping by feature. Quite a large part of his map seems to have been put together, decided by feature. So let's go back to our South Wales thing. And I'm going to try and explain why was it that Smith came up with this idea of magnesian limestone. Well, we're going to go back to John Strachey's theory. And this has been written about by John Fuller, who maintains that that Smith, he called in a paper published in Geoscientist called Smith's Other Debt, where he thinks that Smith actually used the ideas of John Strachey. John Strachey had this idea that everything was in a regular position, and that this was as a result actually of creation. It goes back to the idea that of scripture, and Smith believing in the scripture and in a series of deluges, and that the centrifugal forces of the earth would throw these into a position whereby they would be eastward dipping, and with bassets facing towards the west, as we saw in his preface earlier. And those ideas were prominent in his mind. He did write on the magnesian limestone. Here's Smith's writing on strata in 1803. And he said the yellow limestone of the Redland of the north in England, he called it the Redland, the magnesian limestone, runs because, of course, we've seen it, there are elements of it which are red, runs through Yorkshire northeasterly direction from Doncaster in a tolerably straight line, which is parallel to the North Road. And then he goes on, the long line of Yorkshire limestone, this is important, which may be distinctly traced through Nottingham, Derbyshire, Yorkshire, Durham, and Northumberland, and well known to the eastern boundary of the coal district, which arranged through those counties is discovered with difficulty to the south and west. Though the apparent reddening of the Midland counties may be very wide, I apprehend it will sometime prove to be the same stratum as then which forms the southern boundary of the lands in South Wales, though its colour does not correspond with that of Yorkshire. I have not had sufficient opportunity of examining the fossils in these two limestones to gain that good evidence which they generally offer. And again, that may be significant. He hasn't had sufficient opportunity of examining. He goes on. This is 1803. The Dudley and Walsall limestones are not like the Lias or the Derbyshire, more they lie in line with them with respect to the coal and his incumbent and recumbent strata, but have a greater resemblance to that of Yorkshire and South Wales through their colour. And then his notes get a little bit confused. They put basins, something B, very different. The dip of these limestones are also too much dislocated and disturbed to be readily traced with any connection over a distance, which is very short compared with the long lines of limestone in Yorkshire and South Wales. But he does make a relationship then between the Dudley and Walsall limestones and the limestones in South Wales. So these distinct points being ascertained, there will be less difficulty in tracing the connection from Shropshire through Worcestershire and Herefordshire to its unison with the vast tracts of the same limestones in Monmouthshire, Glamorganshire, etc. Committing this reasoning to being correct, the line of the Yorkshire limestone from its transition at Bucknell should be traced south and southwest to Breeden Hill in Leicestershire, and then to the hills in Warwickshire, to the lime work of Walsall and Dudley, and then across the Severn, Shropshire to Worcestershire, Herefordshire, till it becomes connected with that in Glamorgan. I won't go on with that bit. I'm going to move that. In terms of fossils, he didn't really look very much at fossils. He was very confused about this lime, and this yellow lime or magnesium lime or the Redland lime. He did draw some fossils, but this plate was missed out of his book, of the strata book. So he was rather uncertain as to what these were and where they fit within the scheme. I'm going to move forward. So let's try and recap with that. And we're going to zoom in a little bit on this square, because that's the area of you can see coming down from the northeast coast, that streak of blue abutting against the darker coalfield. That's the magnesian limestone, and we get to its southern part and it seems to disappear, and then it crops up again, according to Smith, in South Wales. And Smith, when we look at that in more detail, we've got various little bits of blue across that bit of map. And if we go first of all to looking at the oh, this should come up. It's not coming up. Animating. Sorry about that. Whoops, let me go back. Why is that not done? This should animate, but it's not done. Whoops. Okay. Let's go back a minute. Go back. Okay, I'll have a look at it here. Okay. You can see there at the top right is the Breeden limestones, and then you come across to what is now termed Wren's Nest, and he's marked that as magnesian limestone. And then is by the Malverns, he also magnesian limestone, and then connects it down through to the Forest of Dean. And we can see there the Malverns part and the Forest of Dean. I'm sorry, I did have the others, but they're not animating for some reason. Also interesting, if you look at his cross section, and here's a blown up section of the cross section, we can see that they're in this regular order, which we know about. This is on his map, but you can see where he's got the Red Marl, the Vale of Severn, the Malvern, and then actually to the west of the Malvern, he's got limestone. All right, and you look at the color of that limestone against the explanation of colors, and that's the magnesium limestone. And here we've got below the coal measures, we've got the Derbyshire limestone. So he's got it, you can see there, it's marked it on to the west of Malvern, that area there. Now, of course, we consider those Silurian limestones. And we go back to his prospectus to get this idea about what it is, and that he's got this idea that these rather these uniform disposition is found on one side of a deep valley or on a channel, over the other over many miles, and it's the motion of the earth, which probably commenced with these strata, were in a soft strata of pulpy consistence, would naturally place them in an inclined curvy lineal position. So Smith's explaining this curvature of strata across England by that theory. And what he seems to do then is say, well, there's no reason to think that the magnesian limestone also doesn't follow that theory, despite the fact that it's overlain by this red material, this red marl material in the middle. So if you project that, you can see with those red lines, that's what Smith thought the magnesian limestone would be like. He continued that. He didn't take any ideas that he should change that, because on his 1820 map, despite the publication of Greenoff's Geological Society map, he marked it still as magnesian limestone because it's in the right sequence, it's in the right place. And he marked it here as you can see the O, which is the mountain limestone, and the M is the magnesian limestone. So, what do we think? Well, Smith was either ignorant of or did not take any notice of contemporary sources in geological information on the rocks in South Wales. Seems unlikely that Smith collected fossils from rocks in South Wales. If he had done, he might have changed his ideas, Smith mapped the boundaries and decided the geology of South Wales largely based on what appears to be topographic and land use evidence. At least that's as far as we can ascertain. Smith decided that South Wales would be magnesian limestone as early as 1803. Smith considered that the strata in South Wales were equivalent and dislocated continuation of a line of prominent magnesian limestone in the northeast of England. Smith had a grand idea based on John Strachey that the strata were ordered regularly. In one sense, that was a great strength to him, but we can see here it also caused complications. Smith did not make any revisions to South Wales on his maps because, and the question is open. I've got a quote here really, which is from Walter Davies, which says, get my version up. That's it. I can't see the top line because of the, let's move that down. Can't move that bar down. And I can't read it. It's just 2 seconds. You can read it while I'm doing it. In the stone of the lias tracts, besides the usual marine petrifications of the white lime tract, are also found arboreous, vegetable, land and animal petrifactions. The difference in accidental contents, if such they may be called, found in these two species of limestone, one having calcareous, the other siliceous freestone, one having metallic ores, the other none. And of course here Davies is making a distinction between the Derbyshire limestone and the lias limestone. One having metallic ores, the other none, one being under the coal, the other never, one having marine petrifactions and marine only, the other adding to those some land animal and some vegetable, and both species of limestone intermingled in separate patches in the same level plane, seems to be a difficulty calculated to exercise the talents of the buffoons of philosophy. Well, it certainly exercised the talents of Smith, but I believe that we can begin to understand some of the reasons why he came up with his idea about South Wales only being magnesian limestone. Thank you very much indeed.